Every spring, thousands of beekeepers do the same thing. They open the hive, check the food, inspect the brood, add pollen patties, expand the space, and think they have done the most important part. But that is exactly where the most expensive early spring mistake begins. Most beekeepers look at the colony through food, bee numbers, and the condition of the queen, while ignoring the factor that stands behind all of it. It is not just a question of honey. It is not even just a question of colony strength. It is a question of heat. In spring, bees do not heat the entire hive. They do not try to warm the air in the whole box. They heat the brood, and they do it with extreme precision, because the normal development of new bees happens only within a narrow temperature range of approximately 34 to 36 degrees Celsius. When the temperature in the brood zone drops, even by a relatively small number of degrees, the colony pays the price. The brood develops more slowly, the bees consume more honey, more worker bees turn into living heaters, and fewer of them remain available to care for the queen, process pollen, and build a strong spring generation. And that brings us to the core of the issue. The biggest invisible loss in early spring is not always Varroa, it is not always lack of food, and it is not always even the weather. It is energy leaking out of the hive. If the hive loses heat faster than the bees can maintain it, the colony enters a state of energetic stress. At that point, the bees are not developing their full potential. They are only maintaining a minimum level of biological stability. That is exactly where the thermal board gets its real significance. It is not magic. It is not a trick. It is not marketing. It is a simple construction element that changes the conditions in which bee biology functions. To understand why, we have to look at the hive not just as a wooden box, but as a thermodynamic system. Heat always moves toward the colder environment. Inside the cluster and the brood zone, bees produce heat through micro-vibrations of their thoracic muscles. To produce that heat, they use honey as fuel and their own metabolic reserves. If that produced heat leaves freely through the cover, the walls, the bottom board, or the empty space around the brood, the bees have to constantly make up for the loss. It is like trying to heat a house with poor insulation and open spots where heat keeps escaping. The furnace is running, but the efficiency of the system remains poor. In spring, that problem becomes even more pronounced. The winter cluster starts to expand. The queen begins laying more intensely. The brood area grows. The nights are still cold. The days may be warm, but the temperature swings between day and night remain large. That means the bees are no longer heating a compact winter cluster as they do in winter, but a brood zone that is increasingly wider and biologically more sensitive. If the internal microclimate is unstable, the colony spends a huge amount of energy just to avoid slipping backward. This is where the thermal board comes in as a heat shield. Its function is not to heat the hive. Its function is to retain what the bees are already producing. When it is placed above the frames, under the roof, it reduces heat loss upward. When it is placed vertically next to the last brood frame, it reduces the volume of air the bees have to keep under control and sends heat back toward the nest. When it is used as an insulating layer on the bottom board, it reduces the intrusion of cold air from below. In each of those cases, the principle is the same: less heat loss, lower energy cost, more stable microclimate. When that happens, the biological picture of the colony begins to change. The queen can lay more steadily because conditions in the brood zone no longer swing so aggressively. The worker bees no longer have to spend a huge part of their metabolic energy on bare survival. More bees remain available for brood care. The area the bees can cover becomes larger. The generation turnover speeds up. The colony no longer chases development, but achieves it continuously. This is especially important if we know that in early spring, every day matters biologically. A colony that enters stable development in April has a completely different starting position for the main nectar flow than a colony that spent half of March and April fighting the cold. The difference often does not show up immediately in a single inspection, but it becomes very clear later when one colony enters the flow with the maximum number of worker bees, while the other is still trying to finish its spring turnover. Another important effect of the thermal board has to do with moisture. Many beekeepers make a mistake when they think that more ventilation automatically solves the moisture problem. That is not always true. The moisture problem is not only about the amount of air moving in and out, but also about the temperature of the inside surfaces of the hive. When the walls and corners are cold, and the warm air from the nest full of moisture comes into contact with them, condensation occurs. That is when we get droplets in the corners, mold, damp frames, and conditions that put even more stress on the colony. The thermal board changes that process by keeping the inner surfaces warmer, closer to the temperature of the inside air, in other words, above the dew point. When that happens, the moisture does not settle as water on the wood, but remains in the air and can be removed through controlled ventilation. That is the key difference. So the goal is not to open the hive as much as possible, but to create balance. Keep the heat where it is needed and remove moisture without breaking the microclimate. If you want a practical system, do not look at the thermal board as an add-on, but as part of energy management inside the hive. Check your equipment description, the material, the board position, and the way ventilation is handled, because that is where the real difference begins between slow and stable spring development. The material of the thermal board also matters. A good insulating element must have low thermal conductivity, enough thickness, and a good seal against the hive walls. In practice, extruded or expanded polystyrene, rigid polyurethane, or combinations of wood and an insulating core are most commonly used. A thickness of 2 to 3 centimeters is a realistic minimum if we want a real effect. If the board does not close the space properly, if air moves around it, and if it does not match the hive construction, a large part of its function is lost. From a practical standpoint, the presence of energetic stress in the hive can be recognized. The first sign is increased food consumption without proportional progress in development. The second is uneven or slowed brood expansion. The third is the appearance of moisture or mold in the corners. The fourth is greater exhaustion of worker bees during the spring turnover. When a colony consumes a lot but progresses slowly, that is a serious signal that the bees are working more against losses than in favor of development. Thermal board also has a significant indirect effect on brood health. Cold and damp conditions favor the appearance of problems such as chalkbrood. When the microclimate stabilizes, when the peripheral parts of the brood are better covered, and when condensation is reduced, the space in which such pathogens have favorable conditions is also reduced. At the same time, it is important to say this precisely. The thermal board is not a direct tool for controlling Varroa. It does not kill the parasite, but it does help the colony become stronger, more stable, less stressed, and biologically more capable of withstanding the pressure of parasites and disease during the critical period. When we add all of this up, we come to a clear conclusion. The thermal board is not a matter of comfort. It is not a trend. It is not about making the hive warm in some general sense. It is about making sure the bee colony in early spring does not waste valuable energy on empty space, cold walls, and unnecessary losses. It is about helping the bees keep heat where it is biologically most valuable, in the brood zone. It is about worker bees being nurse bees, not only heaters. It is about a colony entering the main flow as a production colony, not as a colony still recovering from spring. That is why the hidden spring heat inside the hive is really a matter of managing energy, microclimate, and biology all at the same time. Whoever understands that no longer looks at the hive as just a box with bees. They look at it as a living system whose success depends on how well we protect the conditions in which it develops. If you want to continue this analysis and see how thermodynamics connects with ventilation, brood health, and spring colony development through the next steps, follow the channel and continue the series. The next episode does not start from the beginning. It continues exactly where this one ends, inside the microclimate that determines the strength of the entire apiary.